Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We are coming up on the fourth Sunday in the season of Easter. And I want to begin with the first of the three P's, a prayer. And this prayer has been adapted from a prayer written by UCC Minister Bruce Epperly. And it's a prayer about creation. Holy and loving God, your love embraces creation in its entirety. You love all creatures, great and small. Your creative wisdom gives life to all things. Awaken us to the beauty of all creation, human and non human. May we be creative companions in your quest to bring love and beauty to this world. Amen. The second of the three P's is perspective. And again, we are solidly in the season of Easter. And it also happens to be this coming Sunday coming up on Earth Day, which will happen on Monday. So we've got a few themes coming together for this Sunday's worship service. We have resurrection, we have new life, and we also have care of creation all blended together. Hence the prayer I began with, being creative companions with God to bring love and beauty into the world. For today's perspective and in preparation for Earth Day, I want to briefly summarize the United Church of Christ's statements about caring for creation that date all the way back to 1959, just 2 years after the UCC was founded as a denomination. So these statements can be found in a series of resolutions passed by UCC General Synods. So General Synods convene every 2 years, and they bring together representatives from UCC churches, UCC associations, UCC conferences across the denomination. And these representatives, delegates they're called, then vote on resolutions that speak to the heart of what the UCC is about. So here is a summary. I'm just going to go through a bunch of them. In 1959, again, just 2 years after the UCC was founded in 1957, General Synod issued a call for, quote, conservation and development of Earth's resources for the benefit of all people now and in the future. So, right from the beginning, the UCC has taken a stance in favor of conservation, care of creation, and, as we'll see in just a moment, climate justice. In 1975, General Synod said, quote, as Christians, we are called to be responsible custodians of the natural order and prophetic witnesses for social justice. So this resolution in 1975 also called for, quote, the elimination of world ills such as the misuse of world resources. In 1977, General Synod said, quote, in assessing the energy issue, we should be guided by certain concerns or values that belong to our faith as Christians: the stewardship of creation, distributive justice, and solidarity in the human community. So you see what they're doing here in this one. They're grounding care of creation in our faith as Christians. 1979, General Synod called for, among other things, energy conservation, development of alternative renewable energy resources, and a reduction of energy usage throughout UCC churches. 1983, General Synod said, quote, to understand the world as God's creation is to understand our responsibility as God's stewards and our accountability to God as tenants, to enhance and not to destroy what has been so richly provided. Again, grounding care of creation in the principles of our faith tradition and treating us as custodians or tenants in God's world. 1989, General Synod encouraged all UCC members to adopt an ecologically sound lifestyle, reducing waste, recycling, and lobbying for legislation to eliminate destructive and wasteful lifestyles. In 1991, General Synod called churches to, quote, consider ways to raise UCC awareness of the spiritual dimensions of the environmental crisis. In particular, drawing attention to the lifestyle of, quote, ever expanding consumption. So in the 80s and 90s, the UCC began to frame the climate crisis in the moral terms of wasteful lifestyles and overconsumption. In 1999, General Synod emphasized, quote, our biblical mandate as stewards of God's creation and urged for a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in local churches. In 2005, General Synod called all churches in the UCC to, quote, implement programs for education and action to address issues of environmental protection, environmental justice, and sustainable development. Three more. In 2007, General Synod urged, quote, all segments of the United Church of Christ to address global warming. 2013, General Synod voted to divest from all fossil fuel companies, becoming the first denomination to do so. And finally, in 2019, General Synod voted to adopt the Green New Deal. And importantly, this ties in with the scripture reading we're going to look at in just a moment. Synod affirmed the intersectionality of climate justice with all other justice issues, from race to poverty to migration. The list goes on. So this means care of creation is part of a moral calling to care also for our neighbors. Loving creation is a way to show our love both for God and our neighbors. And UCC Minister Bruce Epperly put it this way: when we love the creature, we love the Creator. So now I want to read from 1 John. I got to grab my text here. This is 1 John chapter 3, and we're looking at verses 16 through 18. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? Little children, let us love not in word or speech, but in truth and action. So First John is an interesting text because we don't know for sure who wrote it, when it was written, or for what purpose. First John is called a letter, the letter of First John, even though it doesn't bear the markings of a traditional letter like other letters that we find in the New Testament. So it lacks an introduction that names the author and greets the audience. And it lacks a conclusion wishing grace and peace or something like that to the audience. So First John may have originated as, say, a sermon or a theological tractate, and then it got framed as a letter and sent to churches. In terms of authorship, Christian tradition holds that the author of First John was the same author as the Gospel of John. And one reason for this is that the language used in First John resembles some of the language in the Gospel of John. Another reason is that First John emphasizes Jesus' commandment to specifically love one another, which is only found in the Gospel of John. But to say that the author of First John also is the author who wrote the Gospel of John is not really that helpful, because we don't actually know who wrote the Gospel of John. There were plenty of dudes in early Christianity named John. So, for example, the author of the book of Revelation is called John, but he's a different John than the John who wrote the gospel. John's gospel, like the rest of the New Testament gospels, is anonymous. the gospel writers never actually identify themselves. So, in fact, the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added to copies of the gospel sometime in the second or third centuries. So, we're relying on tradition here, which holds that these individuals were, in fact, the writers of the gospels, and that John was also the author who wrote the letter of First John. Now, in terms of the ethics and theology of First John, this letter resembles the ethics and theology of John's gospel. There is an emphasis in both of them on love and on loving one another. Also, there is an emphasis in both of them on the fact that Jesus was indeed a flesh and blood human being, even though his origins in some mysterious way go back to the beginning with God. And if we were to read between the lines in First John, we get a sense of why this writer wrote in the first place. When we read between the lines, we can see that the writer is addressing some Christians who held, addressing the issue that some Christians held an early form of what's called Docetism. So, Docetism was a belief among some early Christians that Jesus only seemed to be a human being. But in fact, he was this kind of mirage or a spiritual figure, or that the real Christ kind of descended upon him for a period of time and then left him before the crucifixion. So, various views along these lines have been held by early Christians, and the writer First John may have been addressing this issue. First John insists that Jesus was indeed a flesh and blood human being who died. The reason this is so important to the writer is because of ethics. The flesh and blood Jesus loved flesh and blood human beings. And in doing so, he gave us, flesh and blood human beings, a moral template to love our fellow flesh and blood human beings. If Jesus were just a mere mirage or only seemed to be human, he would not be an adequate moral example. He would be too otherworldly to be an example for us. A side note here. If you read through the 5 chapters that make up First John, you'll notice a lot of us versus them language. The writer even calls those who disagree with him kind of little antichrists. But it's always important when we read language like that to contextualize the New Testament writings, contextualize these 2,000-year-old texts. And we need to keep in mind that New Testament writers were addressing fledgling communities of Christians. And the survival of these communities was constantly in doubt in the early decades of Christianity. And what we know from social scientific research is that threatened groups will emphasize both group identity and their boundaries. So they'll fiercely police their boundaries in order to ensure their survival. So the point here is that First John is a text filled with tension between this kind of edgy language around identity and boundary markers, but also the expansiveness of love as an ethic. So we have to contextualize it in order to better understand what's going on. Now, all of this is stage setting for the verses that I just read a moment ago. The writer begins in verse 13 saying, "We know love by this, that he, i.e., Jesus, laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another." So the writer sees the flesh and blood Jesus as an exemplar of love. We know love by this, says the writer. And that example is the sacrificial love of Jesus. The Greek word translated as life, laid down his life in the phrase, is where we get the word psyche from. So it can mean things like life or soul or heart or the entire self. So the example of Jesus is an example of an entire self-giving in love. Now, the question that emerges when we read something like that is, what does this kind of love look like for us in our daily lives? First John answers this question in the next verse, verse 17. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? Now, this English translation from the New Revised Standard Version smooths out the Greek text. So, what I want to do is I want to translate the Greek literally for you, and then I'm going to smooth it out in a different way. So, literally, it's whoever might have the life of the world. Life is bios in Greek. I mean, life, it can also mean stuff. So, whoever might have the stuff of the world and might see his brother having a need and might shut his guts from him, how can the love of God remain in him? So here's my gloss of that kind of wooden translation. Whoever has worldly possessions and sees someone in need, but shuts their heart and feels no compassion for them, how can God's love be in that person? So you can see the connection the writer makes between seeing someone in need, feeling something for them in our hearts, and having the love of God within us. Incidentally, the word I translated as guts in the phrase might shut his guts from the person in need is used as a verb in the parable of the Good Samaritan. So, what made the Good Samaritan good in that story was that when he saw a man in need, beaten and robbed at the side of the road, the text says he felt in his guts the man's pain. And we gloss that in English by saying he felt compassion for the man. So, what First John is getting at here is something deeper than simply opening your wallet for a homeless person and possibly even grumbling as you do it because you feel obligated to do it. No, First John is focused primarily on our heart condition. Do we feel with a person in need? Do we feel compassion for those who are hurting? That is the first step toward loving generosity. Verse 18 hammers home the point by saying, let us love our neighbors in need by doing good deeds for them and not by saying we'll do good deeds for them. So the emphasis is on action that has been motivated by compassion and love for another. God's love is demonstrated in our loving and compassionate actions toward others. All of this brings me back to the General Synod vote in 2019. I was actually a delegate at that General Synod in Milwaukee in 2019. I was a delegate representing the New York Conference of the United Church of Christ. And we affirmed as delegates that climate justice is implicated in all aspects of justice work. And what is justice? Cornel West once said, justice is what love looks like in public. So connecting love with First John and justice. The writer of First John might say to us who live in the US, and most of us enjoy the world's goods, as the writer of First John says. The writer might say to us, what are you doing for your neighbors in the world who are in need because of the climate crisis? But more importantly, the writer of First John might say to us, do you feel compassion for all God's creatures who are suffering because of climate change? To love the creature is to love the Creator. More to come in this coming Sunday's sermon. And just a side note, we'll not be doing this next week, but I'll pick it up the week after that.